Okay, we're back once again. Here at Claims Denied, I like to hit you guys with some of the greatest guests and some of the hot topics in healthcare. Today we have Jason Ross over at Privia Health. Jason, thanks for taking the time. And how are you doing today?
I'm great. Blake, it's good to be with you. It's good to see you again. I'm doing great. Appreciate being on today.
Sweet. Yeah. Well, you guys and your role, you're at the core really of a lot of things that, I write about and I'm interested in. So I think today will be a really, awesome conversation. But first, I would love to, get to know you a little better, have the audience learn more, a little bit more about your background. Just kind of give, your brief history of how you came to be in healthcare and be at Privia and all of the above.
Absolutely. Yes. Appreciate that, Blake. Yeah. So I would respectfully call myself a healthcare lifer. I've been in healthcare since graduating from college back in the late 90s. I've been at Privia since the fall of 2022, so coming up on 3.5 years. I've got a background immediately prior to that, was working for a large integrated investor-owned hospital system, running managed care, value-based care, and revenue cycle functions for the hospital. I've also worked for health plans, Medicare Advantage plans, Blues plans. But whether it was for the health plan or even in the health system, the common thread through my career, which certainly continues on with Privia, is working with physicians, primarily in provider delegated risk types of arrangements. Lots of acronyms that have changed over the years to describe those types of arrangements, but that's really been kind of my calling card and something that I've enjoyed. And so, yeah, like I said, I joined initially in 2022 here in Privia, working with a lot of our health system partnership markets. As you know, Blake, we've got a couple markets where we've got a health system partnership, given my background. And that role has just continued to evolve. And so now I've got increasing responsibility. We've got single tax ID medical groups in 15 states. And half those states, the portfolio of those states, currently report in the organization that I'm responsible for. So that's my role. It's the fancy title is our EVP of Medical Groups, but that's essentially what that is.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that background. And I know Privia just released their Q1, so would love to dive into that and the Privia model and all those sorts of things. But first, would just love to ask you, as somebody who's kind of played in multiple roles and multiple stakeholders, what do you kind of perceive as like the differences in working for one versus the other? Or, were there certain things that clashed with what you believed at its core about healthcare and what brought you to Privia and those sorts of things?
Yeah. I mean, I think where I'd start, Blake, is really just working in a health system, working in a health plan. When those health systems and health plans worked with independent private practice physicians, whether they were in a clinically integrated network or an IPA, an ACO, those doctors and the staffs that they had tended to be the most engaged and frankly the highest performing, regardless of how what metric you were looking at, whether it was quality metrics or cost metrics. And so I've always gravitated towards physicians. I think about them as small business owners, entrepreneurs in a lot of ways. And so the model for Privia and the large reason for why we exist is to keep those physicians independent, in private practice, autonomous, and continuing to thrive in an environment that gets harder and harder for those types of small businesses to thrive, right? And so whether it's negotiating fair contracts on a fee-for-service level or a value-based care level with health plans, in commercial contracts and Medicare Advantage contracts, again, in fee-for-service or in value-based care, negotiating and deploying technology, medical record technology, population health management or value-based care types of investments, those expenses continue to get cost prohibitive for single physician, small physician practices. We help with that, whether it's battling with health plans on revenue cycle and getting paid. And so all these things that we tend to do for our physicians in a way that is a bit unique in the market from a lot of folks that sometimes we get lumped in and compete with. It's a great business, and something that we just want to get. A lot of doctors want to stay independent. A lot of doctors are learning what it means to become independent. And when you've got somebody like Privia kind of at their back, you've got a company with national scale, really trying to help hyper local practices serve their communities better. That's what's really differentiated the model to me. It's what differentiates the model for a lot of us that work here, and why we're so motivated to keep growing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I appreciate you kind of laying out that thesis there. And it's something I'm very curious about. You mentioned you joined in 2022. Can you kind of walk me through, how have things changed from a macro perspective? I feel like back in 22, value-based care was like the hottest thing since sliced bread, and everyone was talking about it. And now there's kind of been a little bit of a reset. But now in 26, new models have emerged, but also there are other things going on besides value-based care now, or maybe the definition has shifted. And I don't mean to lump you guys just in value-based care, but curious for how the macro has changed over the course of when you've been at Privia.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny you say 2022. I think specifically what I hear from that question, Blake, is like, oftentimes people equate how the Medicare Advantage plans are doing with kind of the prevalence of value-based care and its emphasis in value-based care. A lot of us that have been in the business for a long time have just seen the cycles that these plans go through. And so, I would say back in 2007 and 8, in some of the markets that I was in, we were doing fairly advanced value-based care as well too, both with traditional Medicare, commercial value-based care, and Medicare Advantage. The last couple of years in particular have been a challenging cycle for some of those Medicare Advantage plans. And so, some folks have kind of wondered if some of the luster, the shine has kind of has worn off value-based care. Those of us that have been in it for a long time and will continue to be in it for a long time, it's really just one of those down cycles. And so I think, again, the thing that we're so focused on is we're not just focused on value-based care. Yes, we're going to help the physicians that have attributed lives in a commercial VBC contract, in an MA VBC contract, in an ACO contract. We're going to help them with all of that and help them, kind of be as good as they can be in those contracts. We're also helping them with their commercial fee-for-service contracts and their Medicare fee-for-service. Like, we are helping the entire practice as opposed to just kind of looking at one small myopic piece of their business. We're trying to help them across all payer types, all provider types, all reimbursement types. And so when things are not going so well in managed care or in value-based care, but overall, we've got to be more focused to make sure that the rest of the book and fee-for-service is kind of balancing that out. It's much like a portfolio. And so you've seen a lot of folks that have been really, really focused on value-based care and only value-based care in the last 2 or 3 years, Blake, and you've written about some of these folks. They've struggled. And for us, having a much more diversified book of business, we've got over 100 plus value-based care contracts. We've also got 100 plus fee-for-service contracts with our doctors, with all the Blue Crosses, United, Cignas, Aetnas, Humanas of the world. And so it's a much more balanced, much more diversified book of business that just helps the physicians thrive regardless of what's happening in terms of that cycle that we mentioned at the beginning of the question.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that long-term perspective, especially since you've been in healthcare for so long. And maybe I'd love for your thoughts, or how do you guys kind of analyze like where you're at in the cycle within Privia, internally, kind of, right? Because you talked about the strength of the model is a lot of flexibility, right? Between fee for service or shared savings or full capitation. Like, how do you kind of vet, okay, this group in this market should be this kind of setup versus another market? Like, what's kind of the decision making that goes into that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know that there's a kind of a short or all-encompassing answer. The one thing I would say, a lot of it starts, frankly, with a lot of the actuarial rigor and the underwriting rigor that we put in when we're analyzing contracts with potential payer partners. I think one of the things, there's a lot of asymmetry between the power and the resources that a payer has and the traditional providers have. And again, we exist for many reasons, but one of those reasons is to try to level the playing field and balance out that power and the access to the information that providers have when they're considering a partnership, particularly that has alternative payment model aspects to it with a payer. So, Blake, the underwriting rigor that we undergo doesn't just contemplate what the terms of the agreement are with the population today, but we oftentimes look at how that population has performed historically. And when you start to look at all these pieces of information, it really does bring together a full picture of what the what the guardrails and what those contract parameters need to be for those physicians to have any chance of long-term success in that contract. And so if you don't have that, and you're just eager to get those value-based care contracts, you may sign up providers in a contract where they have absolutely zero chance of success. And I do think you have seen some of those contracts bear out in the last couple of years. I'm not saying we're perfect at that. No one's perfect at it. We're always going to make mistakes, but I do think we take a little bit more of a cautious, prudent approach to those things. And we simply don't give, a pass to payer contracts that don't meet the muster of like, look, these contracts are not going to be great for or sustainable for a physician group for these types of reasons. When we do see those parameters kind of come out, we are very eager, and we will take as much risk as we think is viable and attractive for our physicians. The one thing that I would add to that, and you mentioned capitation, philosophically, we believe very strongly that everyone that's involved in the risk loop, the payer, the provider, us, potentially even in the patients, that there's some level of skin in the game. If one of those participants in that risk loop is completely insulated from the risk, we just don't think that that's a very good model, because you've got moral hazard there. They're not going to have a whole lot of downside exposure. They're not going to feel the pain if things go wrong. And so they're going to make decisions and work at a different level. So I would say the last thing, for us is when we analyze all of those contracts, we analyze those populations and we see a good deal. Our litmus test is does everyone have a little bit of skin in the game, such that like they're going to lean in and really make sure that they're doing all they can to make everybody else, including themselves, succeed or not? And if the answer to that question is yes, they are, then we're going to generally move forward with that agreement.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know Parthas mentioned before, talking about something like shared savings is a good model for everyone kind of has some skin in the game. So that makes a lot of sense. I'd love to, maybe we can contextualize, Privia and kind of post earnings. So post Q1, things are public. And I think it was maybe like last week at the time of this podcast recording. Could you kind of catch Hospitalogy listeners and catch me up to speed on, hey, what's kind of the current lay of the land for Privia? What are kind of current issues, things investors are asking you about, things your physicians are asking you about, kind of current macro environment, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to take it on, and we can kind of go from there. The way I'd start answering that, Blake, is, I think you've heard Parth talk about this a lot too. Our business is nice in that you do have some pretty good visibility into the sales pipeline or implementation pipeline, and so aren't a lot of businesses where 6, 7, 8, 9 months you've got a reasonable degree of confidence in terms of how the business is growing. I would say right now, continuing to knock on wood, things are going very well, right? Our message is resonating with physicians in a growing number of markets that we're in now. We've made obviously a big in public investment with our acquisition of the Evolent Care Partners business at the end of last year. That business continues to kind of stabilize, integrate. We've got a terrific leadership team in place to continue, that's comprised of both Privia folks and some of the Evolent folks, continuing to kind of drive and grow that business overall. I think in terms of what physicians are asking of us, a lot of it is just kind of more of the same. As it'll be situationally specific to their market. A particular payer is giving them a trended issue. There's opportunities for growth in certain areas. There's a lot of discussions that we're having with them, but it's a lot of it for us is just kind of continuing to execute on the playbook that we have, continuing to get our word out to a growing number of physicians that you're either looking for independent alternatives or looking to come out of employment into a different model. And so I would say that like we've got obviously a very solid balance sheet. We're continuing to kind of produce operationally. So we definitely want to find areas for us to grow both organically or inorganically. They've just got to fit in right and make a lot of sense for us. And so it's oftentimes hard for folks that are in operations roles to talk about things when they're going well, almost like when you're pitching a no-hitter. You don't want to talk about pitching a no-hitter. You just want to keep going on. And so But I mean, the business is solid. The business is growing. Those physicians that are with us are, I would say on the whole are very happy. And we're just trying to continue to execute on the playbook that we got in front of us from a 3-year planning perspective.
That's great. Yeah. And that's funny you mentioned that, all the people in the bullpen or on the bench are not looking at the pitcher. It also reminds me of a kicker right before like a clutch field goal, like don't talk to them or, maybe the coach gives a pep talk. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you give the kicker a pep talk or leave them be?
I played football in college, and we never talked to the kicker. We never talked to the kicker during the game. We certainly didn't do it during a pressure field goal. We would give him all kinds of business and grief during practice to kind of steal him up. But no, during the game, you leave him.
It's funny that's awesome. You played football. I didn't know that, but I used to be the kicker in high school just for like 1 year because I also played soccer. And at the end of every practice, we would have this red alert where if the kicker made this, you have to rush onto the field in 10 seconds and kick it, right? It's like everyone practices it. And if you made it, you would run like half as many gassers or something. Did you guys do that too?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh man, must be a universal thing. That's awesome. But yeah, so back to healthcare, we've talked a lot about kind of physician independence, and you also believe around the importance of physician independence and how you really lean into that and provide the capital resources to do so. Can you talk about why you think physician independence is so important? And then I have a follow-up question to that, but maybe we could start there.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think in any given community, you're going to have a healthcare ecosystem that is comprised of various, kind of a very like hospital employed physicians. Maybe you live in a community that's large enough to have an academic medical center, which is employed, but still a little bit different from kind of the standard community-based hospital. Our belief is just that, in every community, those communities are better, healthier, more vibrant when you have physicians practicing in private practice as small business owners contributing to their community and really doing things like these physicians are highly trained, highly schooled, highly educated. And a lot of times they go into various models where the medicine just gets like kind of a little bit more cookie cutter. And it goes against every fiber sometimes in the physician's being to do that. And frankly, they're not always rooted in what clinically is what's best for the patient. And so I think when you've got a physician, and I'm saying physicians a lot, it's also APPs, it's physician's assistants, it's nurse practitioners, those that are prescribing providers. I mean, they've done a ton of work to try to do the best they can for patients. And if they're in an independent private practice, they're calling the shots. They're choosing how much time they can spend with their patients. They're choosing the kinds of patients that they can see. They're choosing the access that they choose to give those patients. And generally, and like I said, I've been at this a long time. When you start to look at kind of however you want to define quality, Blake, on an ambulatory front, sometimes it's a lot easier when you're talking about patients that have chronic conditions, but however you want to define quality, those physicians tend to be kind of top quartile, top decile performance when it comes to quality. They also tend to be top quartile, top decile performance when it comes to looking at the overall total cost of care that their patients receive out both in their practices and outside their practices. So when you have these little units in that ecosystem that are committed to their community, committed to their patients, delivering higher quality, delivering that quality at a lower cost, why would you not want more of that in all these communities? And so that's, it's been for lots of different reasons, which would probably be a separate podcast into itself as to why that independent private practice community has continued to struggle and shrink a little bit. It's been harder to run those businesses, but there's for those folks that say like independent medicine is dead, lots of trends out there that could tend to confirm their bias to that. But we also, I think we run counter to that trend because of how successful we've been and how fast we're growing and how our message continues to get out and resonate with physicians.
I know it could be a whole separate podcast, but I'd love to just poke the bear just a little bit on that front. Because you guys kind of have a front seat to this trend. I find that a lot of folks on the health system side, and I've written about this, but the whole kind of physician subsidy model and the inflation of professional fees and all of these things are like relatively unsustainable from an economic standpoint for a lot of health systems around the country, right? And so I'm curious, have you seen that play out where, I've seen some people say, hey, the pendulum is swinging back to independence kind of thing versus, the employment trend we've seen over the past however many years. But then I talked to some health system folks and they're like, no, physicians are literally lining up asking for us to buy them to save them, kind of thing. So I'm curious how you think about those contrasting, viewpoints.
Yeah. I think the answer to the question is, I think both are right. I do think that and again, if you look at all the potential options for a doctor to practice medicine underneath a bell curve, there's going to be a portion of that bell curve that just prefers to be a W-2 employee of a health system. There's going to be other room under the curve where doctors don't mind being kind of rolled up and aggregated into a private equity platform. And then there's going to be some room under that curve for independent physicians. I think your point on the health system subsidization and their quote unquote loss per physician is widely published by various data sources on an annual basis. Like, if I had $1 for every time I guessed wrong on when health systems would begin to say, look, we can't do this anymore, it's not sustainable, I'd be broke. Like, or I'd be rich because I've been wrong every time. I think your point overall is valid. The way that I and a lot of us at Privia see the world is there's a much more cost-effective way to have these physicians continue to serve their community in a way that's a lot more economically sustainable. But for lots of reasons that I think sometimes just differ, community by community, health system by health system, they have not allowed or relinquished or gone back on a strategy that a lot of them have been executing on for 20 to 30 years, which is the acquisition of certain practices and certain specialties. So, there are certain health systems where we have absolutely talked to them. They're like, look, we can't keep doing this. We need an alternative. And when we talk to them about the alternative, it's just, it could be a little bit scary, a little bit for them hard to understand, to relinquish that, kind of that control, whether that control is actually real or perceived. And then there are other health systems out there that do have the resources or in a market where they can continue to acquire and employ physician groups. And so they have those proverbial doctors, quote unquote, lining up to have to be employed. I do think it's both. On a macro perspective, though, it just, having worked inside of a health system for 8 years, it always baffled me as to why we were not engaging the physicians in a reimagined conversation of what that practice could look like and how we needed their help in making it better. Or just simply finding a more sustainable way to have a partnership where it did not require the kinds of economic subsidization that you see a lot of these health systems kind of currently engaged in with their docs.
Yeah, it is interesting because I know that back when I worked at a consulting firm, we did physician deals, and pretty much all of them are on, productivity models and fee-for-service machines and those sorts of things. And so that solves for a certain kind of business model. But now it seems, maybe there's some other chinks in the armor occurring, or the chassis doesn't quite fit anymore. So it is interesting. I'm curious, like, let's say, Privia has it their way and the independent market continues to grow and that pendulum does swing. Like, how do you think that changes healthcare overall?
Yeah, I think overall, to me, if you're seeing more and more physicians or more and more doctors under that bell curve, a greater percentage of them are independent in our private practice. I think if you get us to a certain amount of density, and we see this data in markets where we have a lot of provider density. So we've got a lot of doctors that are part of the Privia Medical Group and part of the Privia platform in certain geographies. And we've got certain value-based care contracts with large name brand payers where we can see how many of their members are patients in our practices. And we've got good density. So it's not just primary care, it's medical specialists, it's kind of surgical specialists. We're seeing quality go up and we're seeing costs go down. Now, I think that those are pockets, right, where we've got those types of conditions. But I think healthcare gets better. I think healthcare, I think the quality goes up. I think the costs can absolutely go down. We're talking about a large number of physicians that need to come out, but in certain, fairly large states where we've got that provider density, we see it. And it's not just one payer, it's 3, 4, 5 payers where you've got a lot of attribution per payer. And we tend to outperform the market. However, the payer chooses to define what that market is and how they compare us relative to that market. We tend to be, top performers in that. So if you have more of those types of physicians that are out there, because again, there's not a conflict of interest there sometimes, like there may be with a hospital employed physician, where a hospital is worried about certain things that, from their own economic viability are in direct contrast from what these payer contracts are trying to achieve and what their patients are trying to achieve in terms of quality and cost outcomes. The physicians don't have that in general, right? Like a lot of the care that you're trying to address is happening both in the primary care office, but also kind of the downstream care that these patients are getting in specialty and outpatient and inpatient services. And a primary care physician that is holding some sort of risk contract with a payer is trying very hard to make sure they're giving that patient all they can in their clinic so that they do not have to consume care that is unnecessary or avoidable downstream. So there's just not a conflict of interest there oftentimes like there is with some of the other physicians. But I think overall, again, long story, long answer to your question. I think if you have enough physicians that are in a community, in a population dense community, that are oriented this way, I think that you see overall healthcare improves. The health of it improves, the quality goes up, and the cost goes down.
Love that answer. And thematically, you've mentioned the word density, and that's a word I've written about both on the health system side, but also physician side, and in pretty much any healthcare scenario. It used to be that kind of scale and bigger is better at all costs, right? Kind of thing. But now we're seeing some health system downsizing and some, portfolio realignment and those sorts of things. So I'm curious, what does density mean to Privia? Like, what does it mean to have enough density in a market to the extent that you can answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is to your point, I don't know that in the question, I don't know that there is a specific number. It's kind of, I think it's very, specific to the particular geography that we're referring to, Blake. But for us, it's just that there's enough of a number of physicians across a number of specialties, right? And oftentimes for us, it tends to start with primary care being defined as family medicine, internal medicine, but also pediatrics and women's health, OBGYN, right? That to me is the foundational bedrock of our primary care strategy. And so much of care downstream from that emanates from that, right? And so if you've got that core base in a lot of the core specialties where frankly, these physicians, again, they may be operating as discrete care, we refer to as care centers, right? But they're all bound by the common thread of being part of the Privia Medical Group. And so therefore the ethos and the outcomes that they're believing in and trying to drive to are similar. Then you've also got the ability to kind of take care of populations of patients, whether they're with self-funded employer groups or they're with a fully insured commercial plan or Medicare Advantage plan or traditional Medicare. And so you've got the right number of physicians taking care of a fairly material group of population. And you've got enough coverage, right? They can actually kind of quote unquote manage the care that's being provided to that patient population. Ascribing a certain number to it's hard for us to do, but I would say again, in some of our more mature markets where you've got a lot of Privia kind of care centers in a relatively small area, that's where folks that are ultimately bearing the risk for the costs of the healthcare, whether it's an employer or a health plan, finds that attractive because they know that their members are going to be seeking a good amount of their care on a percentage basis from folks that are all part of the same medical group.
Yeah, that makes sense. And you got, like you mentioned, adequate coverage over a number of specialties and primary care and all the sorts of things. And you mentioned employers, and I feel like that's a pretty hot word in 2026. Have you guys dabbled into contracting kind of directly with employers or kind of anything on that front? Or is it mostly kind of by the books today?
Another one of those topics that I think it's been around a long time, Blake, people on the provider side really wanting to deal directly with folks, particularly on the self-funded side. So they are on the hook for all of the expend that either their employees or their employees' covered lives are incurring under the health plan. It's a very attractive kind of opportunity in terms of the theory and the academic exercise of like, look, let's just have a direct contract. In practice, it just gets a lot harder to execute one of those deals. You got to have the right employer that has their own employee density so that they're in a relatively kind of, if they're widely spread out across a geography, that makes it harder to provide kind of a custom curated network that is taking care of much of the care that that particular employee population needs. They've got to have, a degree of sophistication. Typically these health and these benefits are administered by and overseen by HR team. So they've got to have an HR team that actually understands this stuff. Maybe is not being fed information by a benefits consultant that may or may not have kind of skin in the game one way or the other. So again, I think in overall, the theory of doing some stuff with employers is highly appealing, and you can see the value in it. It tends to break down in terms of actually materializing into real scalable kind of long-term solutions for a lot of the reasons that I've kind of highlighted just now.
Yeah, that's good to know. Kind of more of a measured take, which I appreciate, because I have, there's a lot of folks out there that are, me included, that are interested and excited about different models for, cost savings and employer involvement and more direct and those sorts of things. So just interesting to get that perspective. Backing up a little bit, we talked about kind of, private equity involvement and venture involvement and kind of the physician aggregation game, I'll call it, right? So the PPM model and those sorts of things. I'm curious, it seems like private equity involvement has deteriorated quite a bit over the past few years. I don't know, is that how you would characterize it? And then two, how would you kind of assess the current kind of M&A environment of positions and platforms at large, given kind of specialty distribution player involvement and payer involvement and kind of all of that?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't spend a ton of time pulling back on the macros of PE. I mean, I certainly read about it when some of the things come out, and obviously being in the markets as much as I am, we come in contact with a lot of groups that have a private equity sponsor or part of a larger private equity platform. I wouldn't say as it's deteriorated as much as it's just it feels like it's slowed down a little bit, and I do feel like some of the valuation and the transactions have slowed down in terms of their valuation frothiness, and so therefore the volume with which they're starting to transact. I would also say that's part of it. It's a function of this is really hard work. It is very hard work to start to build a unified sense of a medical group and really start to kind of realize the benefits of having a larger group. And I think a lot of times, again, I don't probably going to come across as a little bit of a slam. It's not really meant to be. I mean, but the honest fact is for us, and what we talk to doctors about every day is in the private equity model, the physician's practices is really a means to an end. And the end is a transaction that returns capital back to the private equity folks in the form of their limited partners or LPs. And for a small number of doctors who get that proverbial second bite of the apple, maybe they get a little bit off when they transact a second time. But the growth of that is a means to a different end. And for the conversation that we have with a lot of doctors is like, at Privia, your success is our end. Like, we're not looking to flip this thing. We're not looking to employ or change it. Our goal is, the end of our model is that you're continuing to be successful, that you're continuing to grow and thrive and run the practice the way that you want to. And so it's a discernibly different model with a discernibly different choice. And so again, it's free country. Doctors can do what they want to do, which and so if they want to run the private equity route, that's perfectly fine. It does have some downstream impacts. And I do think you're starting to see a lot of physicians that maybe were a little bit junior or a rung below some of the elder physicians that chose to make those decisions to partner with private equity, them start to see, that window that was wide open a couple years ago has closed quite a bit. and we're being asked to do things at a level, and maybe the expectations for what that second bite, how big that was going to be, is starting to kind of to shrink, if you will. And so, I think that's just part of the model. Again, we talked about the cycle of MA and MA risk. I think there's a cycle to private equity right now, and you're starting to see the cycle kind of shore up a little bit, tighten up a little bit, and not be quite as frothy. And so we are probably having more conversations now than we were when I first joined 3.5 years ago, with doctors that are saying that the Privia model looks a lot more attractive in terms of long-term value creation than it did maybe 3.5 years ago when the private equity valuations were where they were.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think maybe a lot of valuations were out of whack, a few years ago. But to your point, with private equity model, that often comes, in my experience, with some strings attached as far as, non-compete agreements and, maybe there's the path to partnership is different or whatever that looks like. But also there's been recent rumblings just in certain states, mostly on the West Coast, corporate practice of medicine laws at states and, what does that actually mean? And these new bills being passed. So it is interesting. And I imagine a nice talking point for you guys to say, like, hey, we just want you to stick around, right? Like we just want you to be partners and not more or less kind of trapped in the flywheel. Is that kind of fair to say?
I think it is. But then the one thing I would add to that for sure, Blake, is, but let's say you're a physician and your timeline is 2 to 3 years. And then maybe you're ready to slow it down and you're looking for a young couple of partners to bring in and recruit, but they're having a hard time doing it themselves. We can help you do that. Or, hey, I can't tell you, Blake, how many times, and this is what speaks to the difference in some of these 1, 2, 3 provider practices. The doctor gets to the end of their tenure, they're more worried about where their patients are going to get care and that they're going to get taken care of well after almost than they are about what they're going to get from proceeds from selling their practice. I've had that conversation many, many times. And if they're in a market where we've got a couple hundred other Privia care centers, do one of those care centers want to acquire that practice? And the answer to that question more often than not is yes. And so we'll have a way. So it's not just about thinking about the prototypical provider who's got 10, 15, 20 years left and they're still charging hard. You can join Privia at whatever stage you are in your practice of medicine, and we're going to have a suite of solutions that provides you some visibility. Doesn't have to be a surety, but visibility into what the next chapter looks like when you're ready to turn that page. As opposed to just saying, I've got to sell to private equity because that's the only way that I can get liquid. That's just not the case. And so we've got, again, the bigger that we are, the more dense that we are, the more options we're going to have on helping physicians go through those various seasons of their career and their practice and provide good solutions for them that they find both attractive to them financially, operationally, but also in a lot of cases, like I mentioned, that their patients are going to be in good hands because they're getting handed off to another group that thinks and believes and sees the world the same way that they do.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that you're walking alongside the physician and his or her profession, the whole journey of their careers. And so I'm curious within that, obviously there are competitors in this space, other physician aggregators. We talked about private equity, but also, the payer-owned assets of the world. It's like the Optums and the Mosaics, but also the other kind of, value-based care enablers and those sorts of things. So how do you get your narrative and your messaging and value prop across versus that noise?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we've got a number of ways. Let me start with by far the most important way, and that is when a practice that is considering Privia talks to a group of doctors, providers that is already with Privia. That is by far and away the most effective way to talk to a doctor. And we have a lot of our physicians that are part of Privia and have been part of Privia a long time. They are by far the most effective ambassadors for spreading the message for what we do and how we do it. They're real about it. They're not going to sugarcoat it. They'll tell you, where we're doing well, where we need to improve, and which is exactly what we want to hear, what we want these doctors to hear. We also have a growth team that is incredibly well managed. It is industrial grade. It's like very few things in the healthcare services space where you've got a team of folks that are not quote unquote out there selling, but they're really kind of evangelizing and talking about the Privia model and seeing if physicians that they're talking to have an interest in joining that Privia Medical Group in that market. I think the message overall, though, the point of differentiation, which I feel like you were getting at in your question is it's not just about optimizing performance in an ACO. It's not just about optimizing the quality and care management fees in a Medicare Advantage VBC contract or a commercial VBC contract. It is helping you run your practice soup to nuts in a much more comprehensive way. So if you're a physician who feels pretty good about everything else, is not on Athena or EMR, and really just wants to do better in MAVBC, that's really all you want to look at. And maybe we come in and we do analysis. You're like, you know what? You're right. You got good contracts. You're doing a great job at revenue cycle. Your technology, your expenses are, we may not be that. Again, we're not for everyone, but for the most part, most of these small business practice owners are kind of struggling to keep up because it's really, really hard to do so. Not just in MAVBC optimization, but on rev cycle collections yield, on negotiating better rates, on finding good talent, recruiting additional providers, on not getting raked over the coals with every piece of technology, making investments in artificial intelligence to make their practices run, scribing and in kind of, so all the things that are happening right now. And so I think that really for us is our point of differentiation, is just what kind of partner do you want? What kind of problems are you looking to solve? And then frankly, figuring out from that interaction that we have, who is the best person to talk? Is it one of our growth directors? Is it one of our leaders in the market? Is it one of our clinical physicians that have been a part of Privia for a long period of time?
Yeah, I love that. Appreciate that breakdown. And can't help but mention, you mentioned, Athena and artificial intelligence and technology. And I know you're not like the tech guy or anything like that, but since you talk to physicians so much and, you're right there with kind of like, integration and operation and those sorts of things. One, how would you kind of assess the current state of AI in healthcare as Privia uses it? And are you seeing it, significantly change behavior?
Yeah. I mean, you probably heard some response like this from other folks that you've talked to, Blake, is, in a lot of ways, we've been doing things that are now being categorized as AI for a long time. So kind of what is somewhat old is now new again with a new artificial intelligence kind of label to it. Here's how I would answer the question. I think for us, we think about AI in a couple different ways. One is, how is it helping the overall enterprise, right? So like Privia is a Google shop, right? So we've been using Gemini and it's kind of a close to us. So really just focusing on kind of getting smarter and smarter about the business that we run, the contracts that we have, the challenges that we have. And so a lot of our team, myself included, is using that tool every single day with increasing frequency to help make, us more efficient, us make better decisions from the overall enterprise. As you start to get closer to the physician's practice, we're obviously doing a lot of work on the clinical administrative work, right? So we've been, using robotic process automation, building bots in our revenue cycle for a long period of time. That work is just continuing to kind of grow, continuing to expand, and where things are repetitive, redundant, and are frankly being, answered by bots on the health plan side. Why do I want a person on my side? So we're going to continue to do that. You keep going, you start getting closer and closer to the physician and patient interaction. We've also done a lot of work, around are there technologies? And by the way, all this stuff right now is so top of mind. So we are not just saying, oh, that's what we've done, we're moving on. There's this incessant interrogation of, are we getting better? Are there opportunities for us to kind of make investments in these categories that I'm, so this is going to be highly fluid and highly dynamic. But one of the biggest, investments in AI that are kind of closer to that clinical interaction between the patient and the physician is just around some of the value-based care and the documentation and the coding work that happens there. Just particularly when you're dealing with a chronically complex patient population, their patient chart, virtual as it is very, very thick. A lot of documentation over a lot of years. And so to be able to go through that very efficiently and rise and begin to bring connections to non-obvious connections to the human eye and human brain has been huge for us. That's an example that I would feature, but a lot's happening there too. a place that we haven't gone to yet, right, and that we're continuing to explore with a lot of fascination is actual care delivery. Is how does and so I read the interview that you did with the folks over at Numeris and their Tom technology. We're aware of that. That's some fascinating stuff, and those guys are going right at that. Right, they're going right at care delivery and scaling primary care. Very fascinating for us. I would say that we're early innings in that area. But I think the issues around scaling good, competent providers is going to be a problem that's as old as time and only getting worse. And so I think that for us, those are opportunities that we're going to be engaging with our doctors, and our physicians are going to be driving us to say these are technologies that are credible, that are real, that are helpful, that are scalable. And that's the great thing about harnessing the intelligence of 6,000 providers, or nearly 6,000 providers that we have. You get the wisdom of that crowd and these types of things. It feels really, really good as opposed to trying to make the decision on your own.
Right. I imagine, that's your own petri dish, right? With quite a big chunk of the population there. So that's awesome. And as far as kind of development of tools and things like that, you mentioned working with Google. Like, do they have a team you're working with to kind of provide more bespoke, like building solutions for you? Or is it kind of like hey, we want this feature set. And so like, how does that kind of work?
Yeah, I'll quickly get on my skis. I'll probably be a little limited on this answer, but
just high level.
Yeah, we certainly. I mean, what all of our partnerships, technology partnerships, we've got some dedicated resources with them that we're kind of laying out our roadmap. They're laying out their roadmap, and we're trying to rationalize to see what the overall kind of a prioritization perspective. What is the highest needs piece here? I don't know much about kind of our overall tactical interactions with Google overall. I do know that the tool itself, I look at the utilization metrics on that stuff, and it's definitely, the uptake has been great. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that relationship will just continue to evolve over time.
Of course. Yeah. Appreciate that color. And I think, maybe last healthcare question for you as we kind of get to the end of this discussion is maybe just turning it back over to you, like what to expect from Privia, from yourself over the course of 2026 and beyond.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Blake, again, I probably will start with a theme that I hit on a little bit. A lot of it's just, if it's not broken, don't fix it. Right. And so I think there's a long roadway. We talk about in my time, just in the 3.5 years when I first got here, I think we had less than 3,500 implemented providers. We're now knocking on the door of 6,000. We add quite a bit of implemented providers every single year. And I think that just kind of as a core base continues on. And, as when I got here as well, I think we were in 7 or 8 states. We're now in 15 with the Privia Medical Group model, and then obviously in 24 in total, so 9 additional states with our partnership with the Care Partners, Evolent Care Partners acquisition. So our ability to continue to kind of grow our core business, whether it's the PMG platform or continuing to be a high value provider to doctors who are participating in an ACO through the Care Partners platform, just continues to afford a nice, steady level of more markets, more doctors as an audience to kind of communicate to. So continuing to feed that growth. But we are very, very focused on continuing to grow, right? And so again, when people listen to our quarterly earnings call, you hear a lot of questions about the soundness of our balance sheet and deploying capital in a thoughtful and prudent way. There's a lot of opportunity there. There's some dislocation in the market. So how do we deploy our capital smartly? How do we allocate that capital very smartly to continue to facilitate growth, either directly in the model that we have today or in adjacent businesses that are highly complementary to us? It just, I'm not trying to foreshadow anything. I'm just saying we are aggressively looking on how to continue to grow the business and diversify it in a way that continues to help our doctors succeed and thrive. I think to the extent that we can have meaningful conversations with health systems that don't see us as anything but helpful to them in solving some of their existential problems around their employed group, around the so-so performance of a large clinically integrated network that they've had for the last 8 to 10 years that really hasn't provided much in the way of results. I mean, those conversations, we'd love to have those as well too. So just a lot of, I think, a long straight road ahead of us with a lot of different on-ramps onto that straight road that can really kind of influence how we grow and where we grow. But by and large, it's kind of steady as she goes, continuing to build momentum, continuing to be kind of prudent in our kind of our outlook, but also be, I would say aggressively prudent with kind of trying to help our physicians continue to grow and have our model grow across more and more states.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. To continue our baseball analogy, you guys just keep hitting the singles and doubles and, keep scoring runs, right?
My
It's
favorite
maybe not the
baseball player,
sexiest thing, but
my favorite baseball player as a kid was Tony Gwynn. That guy hit for average. So yeah, I'll take that. He's in the Hall of Fame. I'll take
there you
that.
go. Yeah. Hit for average and you're in the Hall of Fame. That's a telling takeaway. Awesome. Jason, thanks for that background on Privia. And I've got one more personal question for you. It's something I ask every guest at the end of every podcast, and it is, what's an experience, book, or piece of advice, something that you've consumed that fundamentally changed how you live your life?
Ooh. That's a good question, Blake. I'm an avid reader. I don't know that I would point to anything that fundamentally changed. Listen, you and I chatted recently, and so I think you're aware of this, but for your audience, I recently helped my mom transition from independent living into assisted living. It was a very hard job. One, she's your mother, and you have a special relationship with her. A lot of planning, and then the planning turns into that kind of that consolidated piece of execution. You got to get the whole thing done. And along the way, frankly, what I learned was just like just a reaffirmation, really, of being kind to others. I learned so much about, frankly, about the people that are in that world and do that for a living and provide those types of situations. Holding my mom's hand through that process, talking her through some things. And she's 82 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was going to be, not living independently right outside of after she left her house. And so I think that experience, Blake, definitely fundamentally changed me, just because of projecting myself at some point in the future and knowing how I would think that I would want to be treated, and the kind of decisions that I would want to make and the kind of decisions I would want to have made for me. I think that for me, what kept coming up is just being a responsible steward and of that, and making sure that you're making decisions for the right reasons, for those people that you care about the most. That's kind of sitting in my near term memory, but definitely made a massive impression on me, and something that I think that not just as a son to my mom, but also obviously as a father to two kids, as I think about our relationship. How we did that, I think we did a nice job. I tried my best to be compassionate with her, and that's left a pretty indelible mark on me for sure.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you for, sharing that with us. That's deeply personal. And as somebody who had a grandma go through a similar experience, I know you're doing, the best job you can, and caregiving is very difficult. So thank you for that. And I agree, leading with, it's not maybe the sexiest thing, but empathy and compassion are some of the best marks of a leader. So, Jason Ross, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Really, really appreciate it. Really learned a lot from you, and best of luck the rest of the year.
Blake, it's always good to talk to you. Hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much for inviting me and having Privia on the podcast today. I appreciate that.